Chapter 6. He surmised that he was in a sort of elevator. The jerking of the rod as he steadied himself in turning toward Volmar had started its downward flight. The thing was falling like a plummet, and he clung to the rod to keep from striking the walls of the shaft. Soon, in the darkness, there came a series of red flashes, almost merging with one another. These must indicate openings from the shaft into the various floors of the main building. Doubtless, by manipulating one or other of the rods, he could check or reverse his descent. For a moment, he thought of trying to do the latter. He would go back to the tower and die fighting beside the fallen Volmar. But Volmar was dead, and what was the use? Heartsick, lost, unutterably confused and bewildered, he felt a black weariness descend upon him like the clinging of some material thing. His remaining will was broken, his initiative was crushed beneath it. With a dull fatalism, a leaden despair, he watched the red flashes. There must be hundreds of them, he thought. He was plunging down to a world whose actual soil neither he nor any other man had yet trodden. Before the end came, he would perhaps attain a glimpse of maddening, insuperable mysteries, and would pierce a little further among the all-encompassing terrors and perils of a hostile planet. He resigned himself. He was not yet weaponless, for the lethal wand, with its green cone glowing brightly in the darkness, was still clutched in his right hand. Abruptly, with no noise or jarring, the elevator came to a full stop. Roverton's limbs and body were inundated by a stream of saffron light which poured into the shaft through a low doorway. At the same time, his ears were assailed by a medley of rumbling sounds and deep metallic throbbings which appeared to come from all around him. He had the feeling that he was underground, that his descent had precipitated him from that topmost tower into the nether vaults of the colossal city. Cautiously, he stooped and squeezed himself through the opening, which could afford ample passage for beings like the opalescent dwarfs, but was rather scanty for a full-grown earthman. Blinking in the saffron brilliance, he peered about him on a chamber so enormous, of such indeterminate scope, that it seemed to partake of infinitude. It was filled with gigantic engines that appeared to use and combine every possible geometric form in their over-beetling bulks of dark stone and burnished metal. The yellow light emanated from a sort of open vat or furnace, in which was a glowing mass of molten substance. There were other flaming furnaces at intervals, and great red eyes that burned in many of the machines, pouring down a lurid effulgence. From some of the mechanisms, huge ramifying pipes went up and vanished in the darkness of a funnel-like dome. In the wildly flickering patches of light and monstrous masses of shadow, Roverton saw dim, titanic figures, but did not realize at first that they were living beings. They were 10 or 12 feet in height, and were strange and uncouth as the mechanisms which they tended. There were also 2 or 3 dwarfs among them, who appeared to be supervising their labors. Roverton surmised that he had stumbled into a power plant of some unknown kind. The giants, mayhaps, were members of a subject people enslaved by the dwarfs and compelled to toil in their subterranean vaults. The nearest furnace, watched by a single giant, was 50 feet away, and its warder had his back to Roverton. Hoping to escape observation in the vastness and gloom of the chamber, the Earthman started to make his way toward certain of the towering mechanisms that were dark and seemingly untended. He had no idea where he was going or what he would find, and he had reached the exhaustion point both physically and mentally. The drug injected by the dwarfs seemed to be dying out in his veins, and he tottered with an intermittent weakness. Also, he was stunned by the loss of Volmar, his captain and comrade. His brain, his senses, his muscles were no longer functioning normally. It did not even occur to him that he might have stayed in the elevator shaft and found his way back to some other level where escape would not offer so many hazards. He nearly reached the shadow of a huge pyramidal mechanism when one of the giants saw him and started in pursuit. The creature came on with lumbering, elephantine paces, and looking back as he fled, Roverton saw its face for the first time in the lurid furnace glare. The thing was a biological nightmare, with one swollen, blazing, sulphur-yellow eye where the mouth would be in a human face, and all the rest a mass of writhing, viperish tentacles around a central slit. The limbs and body were no less monstrous than the face. Roverton ran in an access of horror-stimulated strength, and doubling in and out among the dark machines, he contrived to throw his clumsy pursuer off the track. But there were harsh roarings, audible above the noise of the engines, which indicated that others were joining in the chase. Also, he heard the shrill, sweet sibilation of one of the supervising dwarfs. Luckily, this part of the chamber was untenanted. He ran madly, interminably, in the semi-darkness, and came at last to the chamber's end. Here he discovered a dimly yawning exit, and plunged headlong through it on an inclined plane, going downward at an angle of 20 degrees. The plane led to another vault, deserted and perhaps disused, where he would have found himself in utter darkness if it had not been for the glowing wand which he still carried. By its weird light he saw the looming bulks of other massive engineries. Hastening on between rows of these mechanisms, he heard the roar of pursuit and saw the red flare of moving lights behind him in the gloom. He fled on through an eternity of cyclopean metal cones and cylinders, of black retorts and flameless furnaces, and reached another exit. This led into what was plainly a natural cavern, with rough nodular walls, in which he caught the glistening of pale mercurial ores. The cavern turned and twisted like a serpent, and soon began to narrow. Its floor and sides were damp with drippings, were mottled with the soft, oozy marl. His feet slipped in puddles from which loathly creatures, half batrachian, half insect, writhed and wriggled in sluggish alarm to avoid his feet. With dimming senses and failing muscles, he still went on. His mind was becoming a partial blank. He had almost forgotten everything that had happened, and the horror of it all was a vague, amorphous blur. Even his own identity was doubtful as a half-remembered dream. He was only a dying atom of consciousness, lost in a monstrous world, without meaning or reason, without boundary or end. Slowly, obscurely, he perceived that something was retarding his progress. Long, whitish ropes and tendrils were hanging in a curtain from the cavern roof, and he had blundered into them without seeing. What they were he could not imagine. His brain groped for analogies, for similes that he could not recall. The ropes and tendrils seemed to be twining about him, growing over him, and meshing him from head to foot like a web of whip-snakes, and some of them recoiled and twisted with an undulating motion at the touch of the fiery-headed wand in his hand. Roverton fought instinctively to free himself in a nightmare of dim terror and exhaustion. He swayed back and forth, but the ropey meshes held tenaciously. He sank into a half-swoon, and the wand fell from his fingers. But he himself did not fall, but was supported by the clinging growths. What these were he never knew, but doubtless they belonged to some type of organism midway between the vegetable and animal kingdoms. He heard voices, and saw a flash of light on the pale, hundred-stranded web that held him. With the start of returning consciousness, he knew that his pursuers had found him. But it did not seem to matter greatly. Nothing mattered, now that he had lost Volmar, and had gone astray in the clueless labyrinth of a dark infinity.